Outside one of India's busiest airports, the early evening sky ignites into a fireball.
This cloud just lit up. Felt like you could feel the heat.
Flaming wreckage falls from the sky. It's a horrifying crash.
I realized that the clumps that I saw all around me were either the remnants of the aircraft or dead bodies.
When investigators arrive, they find the twisted remains of 2 passenger jets. 349 people are dead. Vital clues are buried deep underground. Investigators must piece together the day's events.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
Kazak 1907, now reach 150.
How had 2 crews that should have known each other's positions ended up in the world's deadliest mid-air collision? Indira Gandhi International Airport, New Delhi. A gateway to India. November the 12th, 1996.
Busy?
Air traffic controller VK Dutta arrives for the late afternoon shift.
There was one supervisory officer. There was one person who was sitting beside me and he was assisting me. And the things are all normal.
But normal at Indira Gandhi doesn't mean calm. This is becoming one of the most congested airports in the world. In 1990, the government of India signed open skies agreements with several different countries. Those pacts have made it easier for foreign airlines to land at Indian airports. Many airlines are taking advantage of the new policy. Air traffic controllers are now handling more traffic than ever.
The open sky policy acted as a catalyst in the air traffic growth. The volume of traffic grew from, I believe, 175 movement a day to around 225 movement a day.
We have to perform during that time. So whether 10 aircraft come on that time or 20 comes, so you have to handle them.
Just past 6 o'clock, Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 takes off into the sunset.
Gear up. Gear up. Clear on left.
Captain Khalid Al-Shabaili powers the Boeing 747 away from the runway. His co-pilot, Nazir Khan, handles all radio communication. There are 289 passengers on board. Many are Indian workers returning to their jobs in the Middle East.
Saudi 763, airborne 03, contact radar 127.9.
While Flight 763 was on the runway, its movements were tracked and directed by an air traffic controller in the airport's tower.
279, good day.
But shortly after the plane takes off, the tower passes the pilots over to approach controller VK Dutta, who's in another room at the airport. Approach controllers at Indira Gandhi guide planes through the airspace beyond the runways. They're in charge of all arriving and departing flights within 110 kilometers.
The approach controller normally is responsible for arrival and departures of the aircraft which are coming in. They are safely and expeditiously, they are brought to the final approach.
Tonight, Dutta is controlling 5 flights. Some of these are leaving the airport, while others are coming in. His task is to keep those planes spaced safely apart. but not so far apart as to cause any delays.
There's a continuous coordination with the tower who handles the ground traffic. So he would tell approach controller that this fellow is ready, and he is to be accommodated between these two flights. So that kind of dynamics we were doing at that time.
Saudi 763 approaching flight level 100.
Roger, climb flight level 140.
Clear to climb 140, Saudi 763.
This evening, a United States Air Force cargo plane is coming in for a landing. Even though it's an Air Force jet, this flight is Dutta's responsibility.
I think we probably had 3 or 4 back and forths with the controller where he was verifying our altitude or checking on our altitude, telling us about other traffic in the vicinity.
Saudi 763 approaching 140 for higher.
Saudi Flight 763 reaches its last assigned altitude of 14,000 feet. The pilots request permission to fly higher.
Roger, maintain flight level 140. Stand by for higher.
In order to coordinate incoming and outgoing traffic, Dutta wants the Saudi flight to stop climbing.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
Dutta is concerned with another plane, now flying east for a landing at Indira Gandhi Airport. It's a passenger jet operated by Kazakhstan Airlines. The Ilyushin 76 is a massive Russian plane. Originally built for the military, a modified version is now widely used as a commercial airliner. Dutta wants it to pass over top of the Saudi flight before landing. After that, he'll let the Saudis continue their climb.
They were supposed to cross maintaining 1,000 feet of separation.
Kazak 1907, now reaching 150, 46 miles from Delta Papa November.
Roger, maintain flight level 150. Identify traffic 12 o'clock reciprocal, Saudi Boeing 747.
Dutta doesn't want the Kazakh flight to be surprised to see the Saudi jet. Since planes don't have radar to track other aircraft, they rely on controllers to warn them about other planes nearby.
Maintaining 150, Kazak 1907, will report. How many miles?
All pilots tuned to the approach control radio frequency are able to hear one another as they communicate with the ground.
How many miles?
8 miles now.
It was strictly visual and trying to pick up on the radios where everyone else is at and what they're up to.
Traffic is at 8 miles, level 140.
Suddenly, a massive explosion shatters the evening's calm.
All at once, out of the right side of the window, right side of the cockpit, this cloud just lit up.
Those missiles?
To my mind's eye, there were missiles kind of corkscrewing, picking up speed was what they looked like, and they looked like they were coming right at us. We actually started veering the aircraft away before it became apparent that they weren't coming at us.
The Saudi Airlines jet spirals towards the ground.
Billy, this is 1815.
1815, say again?
Got on the radio right away, called the controller.
You saw something that looks like a big explosion.
Then it struck to me that something has gone wrong.
On Dutta's radar screen, both the Saudi jet and the Kazakh plane have simply vanished.
When I saw other blips are coming in, so I watched the sweep again. But they were not there at all.
We then heard the controller call for the Saudi Air jet and the Ilyushin.
Saudi 763?
With no response. That was obviously very bone-chilling.
Something tragic has happened in the skies near New Delhi's airport. VK Dutta is about to become the target of an investigation into one of the deadliest plane crashes of all time.
Kazak 1907, report your position.
At New Delhi's airport, a sense of dread is growing. 2 planes have vanished from approach control's radar.
The worst nightmare an air traffic controller has is the mid-air collision.
Saudi 763.
Together, the 2 missing planes were carrying 349 people.
Kazak 1907, report position.
I gave 1 or 2 calls to Kazak or Saudi.
Saudi 763.
I forward how many kids I have, where my wife is, whom I am related to.
US Air Force pilot Captain Tim Place soon confirms the worst.
Delhi, this is 1815.
1815.
What did you see? 2 distinct fires on the ground.
2 fires on the ground. Confirm?
Confirm. Confirm.
Roger.
My senior came to me, so I told him the accident happened. I told people who were to do search and rescue that the aircraft have crashed at 40 nautical miles west of Delhi.
2 planes have gone down over Chakri Dadri.
Shaki Dadri is a town 65 kilometers west of New Delhi. Its mustard and grain fields are now burning with the twisted wreckage of 2 ruined airplanes.
All of a sudden, the sky turned a bright red color, and I saw fire and smoke.
One plane started to come towards us. There was fire and parts of the plane were flying everywhere. People were running. The plane's engine broke off and the plane started to spin out of control and fell into the field.
I was told that there's been a mid-air collision. Apparently there's a jumbo jet which may be involved, and why don't you just head out? There was this adrenaline rush in that sense. I was very new in the business, and I knew I had to get that story.
Vishnu Som is assigned to report on the crash for New Delhi television. He arrives in the darkness of night a few hours after the crash.
We parked our vehicle on the side of the road, and it was, there was a fair bit of moonlight.
He and his cameraman are one of the first media crews to arrive on the scene.
Hey, turn off the light. Don't want to attract attention. Police have likely cordoned off the area.
I stepped onto the field, and I thought it was a fallow field. Nothing was growing over there because it was just sand. And you know, because it was dark and our only visual reference was the moonlight, we just sort of kept going. And then I remember seeing clumps around me, you know, just these little piles on all sides. And because there wasn't enough light, I didn't know what exactly it was. And then I stopped because I said, you know, something's terribly wrong over here.
Turn on your light. Turn on your light.
I realized that the clumps that I saw all around me were either the remnants of the aircraft or dead bodies. There was a tree just maybe 15 feet away from me, to my right. There was this burnt corpse on that tree, and that's an image which comes back and continues to haunt me even after so many years.
As night turns to day, hope of finding any survivors fades. None of the passengers aboard either plane has survived. 349 people are dead. It's the worst mid-air collision of all time. News of the crash spreads around the world.
What remains clear is that there was more than one set of factors that might have resulted in the collision.
We have two very separate wreckage fields.
Captain KPS Nair is one of the first investigators on the scene.
I was aghast, horrified. I can't explain it because I had not seen anything like that before. It is something which I can't explain.
The Kazakh flight and the Saudi Airlines jet have fallen 7 kilometers from each other. Investigators have 2 separate crash sites to examine, but they know one cause will explain both accidents.
It's unlike a single aircraft falling somewhere. 2 large-bodied aircraft colliding each other in the sky. There are different causes.
How had 2 planes that were supposed to be 1,000 feet apart collided? Investigators consider 3 possibilities. An error on the part of the air traffic controller, an error by one of the crews, or the failure of an instrument on one of the planes. They hope the mangled wreckage will hold the clues they need. Their first priority is to find the black boxes from both planes. They record cockpit conversations along with critical data about the flight, like its altitude, speed, and heading. Although fire has ravaged the wreck sites, the black boxes from both planes are found on the first day of the investigation. But for the moment, they hold their secrets. It will take several months for experts to extract data from the recorders. In the meantime, investigators focus on conversations between the 2 planes and the air traffic controller.
In this particular case, we had the evidence of the ATC transcript.
Without onboard radar, the planes around Delhi's airport rely on air traffic controllers to guide them. VK Dutta comes under enormous pressure. Did he make mistakes that caused the worst mid-air collision ever?
Those times were bad. These media people, they crowd foul. So I told them that, there was no fault of mine.
Hi, I'm VK Dutta. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Have a seat.
Investigators want to know everything that Dutta did on the night of the crash.
Was traffic heavy?
Evenings are always busy.
Dutta's radar doesn't track a plane's altitude. Instead, controllers in New Delhi write a plane's last reported position on a strip of paper. The strips are continually updated. It's the only way for controllers to keep track of the altitude of the planes under their control.
Level information is not there, so level has to be confirmed by the pilot.
Kazak 1907. Now reaching 150.
Air traffic controllers can only know a plane's altitude when the pilots report it.
Are these your notes?
Yes, sir. This is the Kazakh one, and this is the Saudi one.
Investigators learned that Dutta was in charge of 5 flights at the time of the accident, and that the Saudi and Kazakh flights were flying in opposite directions of the same aerial pathway. The area that Dutta manages is divided into a network of air corridors. Controllers use them to channel flights in and out of the airport. But many of the corridors are used for military flights. In fact, even at such a busy airport, there's only one main corridor for commercial planes. In cases like this, there are strict rules he has to follow.
Between 2 aircraft, the requirements specify a vertical minimum separation of 1,000 feet.
When aircraft fly through the sky, they leave turbulence in their wake, like boats on the water. It can affect the planes around them. Air traffic controllers deal with this by keeping planes at different altitudes.
Roger, maintain flight level 140, stand by for higher.
Dutta was supposed to ensure that the two planes were 1,000 feet apart as they approached each other. He planned to do what he'd done many times before, have the incoming plane pass 1,000 feet over top of the outbound plane. It was a routine procedure, but somehow the two planes had ended up on a collision course. One of the two planes was not where it should have been. Investigators wonder if Dutta made a mistake that led to the horrific crash. Poring through the ATC transcripts, investigators quickly learned that Dutta had given the two planes the proper directions. But since his radar doesn't display altitude, there was no way for him to tell if the planes followed those instructions. Investigators are so convinced that Dutta did nothing wrong that 3 days after the crash, he's back on duty.
When my family and other people heard this, there was a little sigh of relief that, our guy is safe.
Investigators return to the crash site. They are hoping to recover certain instruments from the two aircraft. Perhaps a mechanical failure had led one of the planes off course.
Normally, the altimeter would have stopped at that point where the accident took place. And we wanted to know what altitude they were registering at the time of the accident.
But the Saudi cockpit has plunged deep into the ground. The accident investigation becomes an excavation.
The Saudi's nose portion was well below the earth. It was about 10 to 12 meters below. The end of the nose had gone that far below. Machines had to be brought in, excavators, to dig up and lift the cockpit of the Saudi aircraft.
The altimeters of the Kazak flight are easier to find. That plane didn't crash nose first. There's some chance there are clues about its exact altitude at the time of the accident. When they're pulled from the wreckage, investigators discover that there is indeed something strange about the altimeters. Both the captain and the co-pilot have an altimeter in front of them, but in this case, they do not have the same reading.
There was a difference between the two by about 300 feet.
Strange.
Perhaps the conflicting altimeters had led the crew off course. But the difference in readings may simply have been caused by the force of the crash. At this point, investigators don't know.
Mostly there and there, as close as you can get it.
Investigators need to discover which of the two planes was at the wrong altitude. They explore other evidence. The pattern of the damage on the two planes may help answer a critical question.
What was the relative angle between the two aircraft at the time of their contact?
Most of the pieces from the two planes are kilometers apart, but a large section of the tail from the Saudi aircraft is found near the beginning of the debris field. This suggests it was one of the first pieces to come off that plane.
The significant points of contact in this particular accident in the air was between the tail end of the IL-76 and the wing portion of the Boeing 747 of Saudi Air.
The tail of the Kazak plane appears to have pierced through the left wing of the Saudi jet. If that's the case, the Kazak flight hadn't been above the Saudi jet when they collided, as air traffic controllers thought. It must have been below it. It's a puzzling discovery that adds to the mystery. Investigators still don't know which plane was in the wrong airspace. What they do know is that once the two planes hit, there was no hope for either crew. After hitting the other plane's wing, the Kazak plane's tail tore through the horizontal stabilizer at the rear of the Saudi 747. 5.5 meters of it is torn off. Without it, the Saudi crew can't control their plane.
The result is the aircraft goes into uncontrollable spiral. And in this particular case, if I would say both the aircraft had got into that situation.
What they've found in the wreckage of the two jets frustrates the investigators. They now understand how the planes collided, but they still don't know why they were at the same altitude, or in fact, what altitude they collided at. How had the Kazak jet, which was supposed to be above the Saudi flight, ended up below it? Almost 2 weeks after the accident, Captain Ashok Verma joins investigators at the scene.
By that time, the operations for digging the Saudi cockpit had been completed. Whatever equipment was recoverable had been recovered.
Like the rest of the evidence uncovered so far, the instruments from the Saudi plane don't help explain what happened. The force of the crash has completely destroyed them.
I can't find anything. Too much damage.
I agree. Look at this.
We could hardly find any useful material.
With the disappointing discovery, investigators are forced to move on. They've learned all they can at the crash site. The case now depends on what they can find out from the black boxes. Investigators hope that somewhere on the cockpit recordings or buried in the flight data are the clues they need. Where were the planes when they collided? And how had they ended up on a deadly collision course?
Get to the 150, present the 140. Start to go!
It's been 3 months since the mid-air collision of two passenger jets near New Delhi. Investigators have been frustrated by a lack of conclusive evidence. They hope the plane's black boxes will help them solve the case. In order to avoid any suggestion of bias, the boxes from the Saudi flight are being analyzed in England. Technicians from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch try to extract valuable data.
The neutrality of state where the recorders are handled was an essential thing.
Each plane was equipped with 2 black boxes, a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder contains information on dozens of aspects of a plane's performance. Among them, the altitude, the airspeed, and the changes pilots make to the flight controls. The cockpit voice recorder picks up all the conversations in the cockpit.
279, good day.
As investigators try to learn more about the collision near New Delhi, they use the information stored on the black boxes to make a chronology of events. Peter Shepard is head of the recorder section of the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. He'll work backwards from the moment of impact.
The point of collision is reasonably well defined by rapid changes in parameters on each aircraft. If we make that our time zero point, we can then relate that to the individual times and build up a common time base.
First, Shepard and his team concentrate on the Saudi 747.
Saudi 763 approaching 140 for higher.
Roger, maintain flight level 140, stand by for higher.
Saudi 763 will maintain 140.
The CVR reveals that the Saudi pilots received clear instructions about their altitude and seem to have understood them. After being told to hold at 14,000 feet, there was no discussion of climbing to a higher altitude, which would have taken them into the path of the Kazakh flight. Next, Shepard looks at the flight data recorder to confirm that the Saudi flight actually followed the instructions it was given.
The recorder from the Saudi flight showed us that the altitude had been normal during climb out.
The Saudi pilots leveled off at 14,108 feet, well within their safe corridor.
It had leveled at its assigned altitude of 14,000 feet and continued to fly level.
The Saudi pilots followed the ATC instructions meticulously, which is borne out by their confirmatory calls back to the ATC.
Air traffic controllers wanted the two planes separated by 1,000 feet and wanted the Saudi plane to fly below the Kazakh jet. If the Saudi pilots did nothing unusual, suspicion is growing that somehow it was the Kazakh plane that was in the wrong place. Alarmingly, when investigators examined the information from the Kazakh jet's flight data recorder, they discover that it descended far below the 15,000 feet it was supposed to stay at. Moments before the collision, the Kazakh plane is at 14,100 feet, almost 1,000 feet lower than its assigned altitude, and less than 10 feet below the Saudi flight. It then powered directly into the Saudi jet.
The Kazakh crew had not stopped descending at the altitude they were cleared to, that was 15,000 feet.
But why had the Kazakh flight dropped so badly off course?
Kazakh 1907, report position.
Kazakhstan Airlines presents one theory for their plane's dramatic loss of altitude.
The Kazakhstan defense mainly relied on presence of turbulence.
Perhaps a sudden burst of turbulence had forced the plane lower. The data recorder of the Kazakh flight does seem to indicate that the crew had a bumpy ride. It shows two distinct and sudden drops of more than 400 feet. The airline claims both of these drops were caused by turbulence. But Peter Shepard isn't so sure.
When we saw the jumps of 250, 500 feet, our initial response was that these can't be right. I mean, it was the rate at which they changed was beyond that an aircraft could actually perform.
What else could cause the plane to drop so quickly? Or at least seem to drop so quickly? Shepard searches for an explanation.
We tried to resolve the inaccuracies in the Kazakh recording by looking at the other parameters that were recorded and trying to derive altitude using these other recordings.
It's intricate math. By using information including the speed and rate of descent from the flight data recorder, Shepard determines that the plane was on a steady downward approach. The reason for the apparent sharp drops is simple. Shepard learns that the sensor that sends altitude information to the flight data recorder was faulty. It would stick and temporarily stop sending information. When it got unstuck, it would wrongly appear as though the plane had lost considerable altitude.
It's as if there was a bit of glue on one area and it stuck in that. And eventually the altitude changed so much, the force on it made it jump again, and it stuck there for a little while.
Investigators can now conclusively dismiss turbulence as a factor in the collision.
So there's no sudden descent?
Scanning maintenance records, investigators also discover that there was no problem with the Kazakh plane's altimeters. They conclude that the difference found in the cockpit instruments was a result of the crash. It didn't cause it. To understand why the Kazakh plane kept descending after it was told to hold, investigators turn to the cockpit voice recorder. It begins long before the crash itself. Initially, there are no hints that anything is wrong.
Kazakh 1907. Report level passing.
Passing 240, Kazak 1907.
Because the Ilyushin 76 is a modified military plane, it has another unusual feature, a position for a radio operator in the cockpit. Igor Rep mans that position and handles all communications for the Kazakh flight.
Roger. Over to Delhi approach 127.9.
127.9, bye-bye, Kazakh 1907.
As the aircraft nears the airport, Rep gets in touch with approach controller Dutta.
Delhi approach, good evening. Kazakh 1907. Passing 230 to 180.
I told Kazak to descend and maintain flight level 150. That is 15,000 feet.
Roger, Kazak 1907. Descend, flight level 150. Report reaching.
1,000 feet vertical separation is sufficient, and that was granted to the two aircraft.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
The Kazakhstan radio operator had at one time stated reaching flight level 150.
It's just 1 minute before the impact. And at this point, the Kazakh plane appears to be right where it's supposed to be, 1,000 feet higher than the Saudi plane. But investigators know that instead of leveling off, the plane continued to descend.
This is where the trouble starts.
As investigators compare the flight data information to the cockpit voice, they notice something disturbing.
Kazakh 1907, now reach 150.
When Rep calls out that they've descended to 15,000 feet, he's actually over 1,000 feet higher than he thinks he is. Investigators wonder how he could make such an enormous mistake. Why would he say he was at 15,000 feet, when in fact he was at 16,000? They consider the layout of the cockpit.
A radio operator does not have his independent altimeter. There are two metric altimeters fitted in front of, one each in front of the pilots. With some effort, the radio operator could also see this.
Whatever the reason, Rep is mistaken about his plane's height, and he's the only one in contact with the ground. Despite being told to remain at 15,000 feet, the plane continues to descend. As it does, Dutta issues a warning to the Kazakh pilots.
Identified traffic, 12 o'clock reciprocal, Saudi Boeing 747 and 10 miles. Likely to cross in another 5 miles. Report if in sight.
He tells them to watch out for the Saudi flight, but the Kazakh jet just keeps flying lower.
Ahead. Ahead.
Just before the crash, Igor Rep seems to have recognized that the plane is now flying dangerously low. But his warning doesn't come in time.
Keep the 150. Do not descend. Accelerate, Sanyo.
The cockpit voice recorder proves what investigators found in the flight data. At the time of the crash, the Kazakh jet was trying desperately to get back on course.
Get to the 150. It was at the 140. Stop the one!
But investigators are still puzzled. Why had the Kazakh plane kept descending?
After ruling out controller's error, ruling out the mechanical failure, do you have to go further into details of human behavior during the operation of a flight?
Kazakhstan is one of several now independent republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. The national airline has a reputation at Indira Gandhi Airport.
There was always a sense that, these were small fly-by-night operators essentially doing the charter business, and they didn't necessarily follow the conventions of modern Western aviation.
We examined their background of knowledge of English language. The crew in the Soviet states, they pass English examination, but they're not fluent in spoken English.
Verma now listens more closely to the cockpit voice recorder. looking for an indication that the crew misunderstood their instructions. Had a language barrier caused the crash?
How many miles?
Traffic is at 8 miles, level 140.
Did the Kazakh pilots confuse their own altitude with that allocated to the Saudi aircraft?
Report 8 miles.
Verma finds that members of this crew weren't communicating clearly with each other. Igor Rep was responsible for communication with the ground, but there's no indication that the pilot and co-pilot were listening to his instructions.
Switch on, engine inlet heating.
While the rest of the crew was busy discussing arrival procedures, Rep alone seemed to be occupied with their altitude.
Now looking, 1907.
It is a usual practice that the briefing for the arrival is completed before start of descent, so that all crew can pay full attention to the radio.
While the radio operator appears to have understood that the Saudi plane was at 14,000 feet, investigators believe the co-pilot thought that he was cleared to 14,000 feet and continued his descent.
Hold the level. What level were we given?
When the pilot does respond, he seems confused.
I think pilots did not pay that much attention and relied too much on the radio operator and to navigate the aircraft during this critical phase.
The decision to increase power and stop descending ends in tragedy.
Keep the 150. Do not descend. Accelerate, Sanyo. Get to the 150 because at the 140. Stop the one!
The final report points a finger squarely at the crew of the Kazakh plane. In the wrong place at the wrong time. A simple misunderstanding led to the deaths of 349 people.
The investigation concluded that the primary cause of this mid-air collision was non-adherence to the authorized altitude allocated to the Kazakhstan aircraft.
Investigators are confident they know what caused the worst mid-air collision in aviation history. But there are steps they want the industry to take to help make Indira Gandhi Airport safer. What they find is that the technology that could have prevented this accident was already at the airport.
Saudi 763.
Investigators have determined that poor cockpit communication and a simple misunderstanding caused a devastating accident which killed almost 350 people. But technology existed that could have helped avoid this accident. Systems that would have helped both the pilots in the air and the controllers on the ground. Investigators are especially critical of the radar that was being used in New Delhi.
Air traffic controllers did rely on fairly outdated technology at that stage. There wasn't any secondary radar available at Delhi Airport. There was only an old primary radar.
Primary radar sends out radio signals to locate airplanes in the sky. The signal bounces off the plane and back to a dish on the ground. It reads a plane's position, but not its altitude.
The primary radar gives you a 2D picture.
Secondary radar works differently. A transponder aboard an aircraft sends a message to the ground with key information about the flight, including its altitude.
Saudi 763 approaching flight level 100.
Roger, climb, flight level 140.
On the day of the collision, approach controller VK Dutta could only rely on what the crews told him about their aircraft's altitudes.
Kazak 1907. Now reach 150.
The Kazakh radio operator said that they were flying at 15,000 feet, but Dutta had no way to confirm that. If he had known the Kazakh flight's actual altitude, he could have diverted the Saudi flight from its path.
That is the 3D picture. So you have some time to react to it. You can take the aircraft away.
At the time of the accident, India had ordered a $118 million air traffic control system with secondary radar and more sophisticated communications and navigational equipment. The system had originally been scheduled to be installed 2 weeks before the accident. But on the day of the crash, the system hadn't even been unpacked.
Secondary radar is an advancement on the primary radar. And in this particular case also, by getting the altitude information, it could have been possible that the accident of this nature could have been avoided.
In the year following the accident, there would be 3 near misses near Indira Gandhi Airport. It would take more than 2 years for the secondary radar system to be installed. Today, controllers at Indira Gandhi International Airport see an airplane's flight number, altitude, and heading. It's far more information than controller VK Dutta had available to him on the day of the accident. Experts believe another piece of technology could have helped prevent the collision: TCAS.
TCAS equipment generates caution and warnings for the crew. It allows them time to react, draws their attention to the situation around, and it looks into the vertical separation.
TCAS is a collision avoidance system that can be installed on board airliners. In many countries, the technology is mandatory. It alerts pilots when other flights are coming too close. The system also automatically tells them what evasive action they should take. Neither plane was equipped with TCAS. The Indian Airports Authority has also made the airport safer by redesigning the air corridors coming and going from the runways. At the time of the collision, there was one main air corridor for commercial planes landing and taking off from Indira Gandhi International Airport. With the increase in air traffic, that single corridor was becoming too crowded. In the wake of the accident, more air corridors were opened for commercial flights.
In general, aviation safety standards has improved. The concern for the safety has improved.
Out-of-date technology and poor communication led to this crash. But like almost every aviation accident, it was a chain of seemingly minor events that ended in disaster.
In retrospect, were some very unlucky people to meet in the sky that night. You know, it's a 1 in a million chance for that to happen. Certainly there were other things that could have helped: radar, collision avoidance systems, and I think we continue to make advances there. I don't worry about flying. Certainly, you know, destiny, I don't know. It was glad we weren't 5 minutes in front of where we were at, that's for sure.
VK Dutta went on to have a long career as an air traffic controller. Today, he works at a college training young controllers.
So I'm chief instructor there. So I'm training ATCUs. I'm addicted to my job. I love it. I really love it.
Dutta, who was initially suspected of having caused the crash, helped implement the changes to make New Delhi's airports safer. His efforts have paid off. The airport now handles 20 million passengers a year. Since the new radar system was installed and the new corridors opened, there hasn't been a fatal accident at this airport. 639 pieces of wreckage are recovered from the sea. 639 pieces that only deepen the mystery of a deadly plane crash.
All right, a little bit more to the right. There.
But when investigators bring up the 640th piece of China Airlines Flight 611, they get their answer.
There was definitely a eureka moment on the dock.
It would be scrutinized more closely than any other piece of debris. On this single piece of wreckage, investigators would find the one clue that would tell them why a modern jetliner with 225 people on board shattered in midair.
Feet. Speed is low, sir. Watch it. Did you feel that?
Target control, descend and maintain. Echo Foxtrot, 126.
May the 25th, 2002.
Gears up.
A China Airlines 747 lifts off from Taiwan's capital, Taipei.
Taipei approach, Dynasty 611, airborne passing 1,600.
Dynasty 611, Taipei approach radar, contact climb and maintain flight level 260.
260, Dynasty 611. Autopilot B, engage.
China Airlines is Taiwan's national airline. There are 225 people on board Flight 611. Today's flight is a short one, 1 hour and 40 minutes across the Taiwan Strait to Hong Kong. This route is one of the most widely traveled on the planet. It makes so much money, it's called the Golden Route.
Ladies and gentlemen, the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off. For your safety, we do recommend that you keep your seatbelt fastened at all times while seated.
Minutes after taking off, Flight 611 climbs steadily above the Taiwan Strait. The plane's autopilot controls the ascent. And then, 20 minutes after taking off, at an altitude of almost 35,000 feet, at Taipei Area Control, the flight vanishes from radar.
Dynasty 611, Taipei. Dynasty 611, Taipei. I've got a plane off radar. China Airlines 611. Its last known return was east 119.67, north 23.98.
Taiwanese authorities quickly launch one of the largest rescue missions in that country's aviation history.
本时段备勤同仁，本时段备勤同仁，请立即至值班室集合。科研麻，你帮我。海顺动幺，海顺动幺，呼叫美方动幺，听到请回答。
我是同时下达。
I gave a clear order that the priority would be searching for whoever was still alive, then bodies, and then, only then, wreckage.
务必全力以赴。
More than 1,000 people take part. Fishing boats, the Coast Guard, and Taiwan's military race out to sea. Flight 611 was 55 kilometers from the Taiwanese shore, just north of the Penghu Islands, when it disappeared. Rescuers find debris floating in the Taiwan Strait.
First thing we saw was a great amount of wreckage, including landing gear wheels, napkins, knives, and forks.
Wreckage from the plane is spread far and wide. Some items are found on land more than 100 kilometers away in central Taiwan. As the rescue effort continues, Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council begins its investigation into the crash of the 22-year-old plane.
747-200, delivered August 2nd, 1979.
Kay Young is the managing director of the ASC. He'll be leading the investigation.
We're setting up a command post in Penghu Island. Let's go.
China Airlines have had very, very poor safety record. As a matter of fact, it was considered one of the worst in the world. Typically, it had like one major accident every 4 years. This particular investigation was by far the most difficult one. And one of the reasons why was it's in the ocean floor.
The search for survivors goes on around the clock. There were 225 people on the airplane. Nobody is found alive. The bodies are taken to the Penghu Islands to be identified and examined. Since the accident involved an American-made plane, the NTSB joins the investigation. A team of investigators is dispatched to Taiwan. They'll be led by John DeLisi in Washington.
We have a very good working relationship with the ASC, the Aviation Safety Council of Taiwan, so we knew that they would ask for and welcome our assistance in the investigation.
Wreckage that's found floating is also brought to the Penghu Islands. Investigators need to know how one of the world's most successful planes, on one of the world's most traveled routes, simply fell out of the sky.
Well, the Boeing 747 is the world's most popular jumbo jet, and it's flown millions of people, probably billions of miles. We were very concerned.
Good morning. I'm anxious to see what you have.
Sophisticated ground-based radar tracked Flight 611 throughout its short journey. It should provide investigators with a much clearer picture of the flight than the radar at air traffic control. Kay Young gets the first major clue in this case. The radar tracked the plane as it climbed on course to 35,000 feet. Then suddenly, Flight 611's signal split apart.
The breakup is quite graphic. Right when the event happened, it appeared as if there were 3 or 4 sizable pieces of wreckage that were getting radar returns that then began to drift and scatter as they fell to the earth. So that told us that the airplane broke up in flight.
Investigators now must turn their attention to finding out what caused that breakup.
There's all kind of theories about, what seems to be happening of that particular aircraft.
We knew that something massive had happened suddenly, without warning.
It doesn't take long for the media to consider a sinister possibility. That Flight 611 was shot down. China and Taiwan have a combative relationship. China has fired missiles towards Taiwan in the past. There's suspicion in the media that China shot down Flight 611.
There were a lot of theories about, it was shooting down by enemy fire.
Only 8 months earlier, a Siberia Airlines flight with 78 people on board was shot down over the Black Sea. It was accidentally hit by a missile fired from Ukraine during a training exercise. On the day of the China Airlines crash, China was conducting military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. But officials there insist no missile was launched towards Flight 611. None of the wreckage recovered so far has any of the telltale signs of being hit. And there's no evidence on radar that there was ever a missile heading for Flight 611.
Once the evidence began to come in, it very quickly ruled out a missile, much the same way that it ruled out it being a mid-air collision. There were no other objects in the air near the airplane.
Few things would cause a plane to break up in mid-air. One of the big ones is a bomb. Medical examiners check the bodies that have been recovered for burn marks and shrapnel. They find none. The plane's metal skin would be torn and curled in a very particular way if there had been a bomb on board. Investigators find no such damage on any of the pieces. But to rule out a bomb, they'll have to find more wreckage.
I think that'll be it for floating wreckage.
The team from the NTSB arrives in Taiwan.
Morning, I'm Clint Crookshanks from the NTSB. Hello.
Good to see you, gentlemen. I'm afraid we still don't have much.
Clint Crookshanks is a structural engineer who knows the 747 intimately.
I didn't have any preconceived notions. This was my first major accident working for the NTSB.
We are not getting much from the floating debris. In-flight breakup. That's all we know.
Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Authority doesn't take any chances. They ground all of China Airlines 747-200 series planes until they can be inspected for mechanical flaws. This puts added pressure on investigators to find out what happened.
Thank you for bringing these.
To the NTSB, this accident seems to have a lot in common with one of the world's most studied plane crashes. That of TWA Flight 800, 6 years earlier. Like the China Airlines flight, it broke into pieces while still climbing. That plane crashed into the Atlantic shortly after taking off from New York.
TWA Flight 800 was the biggest investigation the NTSB has ever done. It lasted about 4 years.
The painstaking investigation uncovered a design flaw with the 747. Wiring near one of the plane's fuel tanks could spark and ignite the fuel in the tank. Investigators conclude that's what likely caused the crash. Investigators are struck by similarities between the two flights. Both were 747s. Both disintegrated without warning while still climbing. Both flights took off in very hot weather. The heat may have caused Flight 800 to explode. That plane sat on the tarmac with its air conditioning running. Investigators believe hot air from the air conditioner overheated the plane's fuel. The early evidence is pointing to a repeat of TWA Flight 800.
So it looks really very, very similar. So therefore, our immediate focus was essentially the central fuel tank.
3 weeks after the crash, the Jan Steen, a sophisticated salvage vessel, arrives in the Taiwan Strait. It's equipped with divers, a diving chamber, and a remote-operated submarine, complete with sonar and video cameras.
The NTSB were tasked with manning the recovery vessel and watching video screens from the ROV.
Using sonar, investigators have located the wreckage of Flight 611 deep underwater.
All right, to the right a bit.
Clint Cruikshanks knows all the pieces that make up a 747, but he's never seen them like this.
It was really quite a shock when I first saw pieces on the floor of the ocean. With only the lighting of the ROV to guide you, you would notice something that looked like an airplane part. The ROV would then circle around the part, looking at it from all angles.
Cruikshank's job is to help the Taiwanese identify specific airplane parts among the wreckage.
I think it takes a different kind of mind to be able to look at a mangled part and kind of straighten it out in your head to really determine where it comes from on the airplane.
All right, a little bit more to the right. All right, go back. There, okay, that's definitely a piece of wing. Let's mark it.
Once a piece is identified, its GPS coordinates get recorded. The GPS mapping tells investigators that the debris is spread out over 325 square kilometers. It will be difficult to track down specific pieces of the plane. 25 days after the crash of Flight 611, the plane's 2 black boxes have been found. One contains voice recordings of conversations in the cockpit. The other, data from the plane's flight computer. Either could hold the clues that will reveal what happened during the final minutes of the flight. If the answer is on the tape, investigators may not have to bring up more wreckage to the surface. The data is critical.
Everybody ready?
Investigators begin with the plane's cockpit voice recorder. They hope that the pilots will have said something to each other about an emergency on board.
Welcome aboard, China Airlines.
The recording begins about 10 minutes before the plane took off.
20.
Preparations for the flight sound normal.
Okay, after start checklist.
After start, anti-ice.
The crew checks all their systems and runs through standard checklists.
Off. Off.
It was very, very experienced crew. Both the captain and the first officers were quite seasoned.
Dynasty 611, runway 06, wind 050 at 9 are cleared for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, Dynasty 611. Takeoff. $80.
Check.
V1. Rotate.
Flap 5.
1 green. Okay, flap up.
Investigators listen to more than conversations. They also want to hear if the plane itself was making any unusual sounds.
Noises on the cockpit voice recorder can either be audible spoken words that are recorded by a microphone, or they can be structural discrepancies that are picked up by the microphone.
Cockpit control.
If anything, though, this cockpit is unusually quiet. The captain seems relaxed.
200 knots, roger. Airway 608.
The microphones pick up the sound of controllers talking to other planes.
Asia 536, fly heading 050.
Heading 050.
In the moments before the disaster, nothing seems wrong. There are no unusual sounds.
Now descend and maintain 250.
The final words spoken in the cockpit are from Captain Yi Ching-fung.
2,000.
He calls out the distance to their cruising altitude. That's followed by the sound of a chime, alerting the crew that they're nearing 35,000 feet. And then the cockpit microphone picks up the sound of the plane breaking apart. Half a second later, the recording stops.
The cockpit voice recorder indicated that the conversation of the cockpit crew were totally normal, and all of a sudden just died.
The recorders told us that something happened, but it wasn't enough to tell us exactly what it was yet. Many things had been ruled out by then, but we didn't have the golden nugget. We didn't have the real piece of evidence that told us what initiated the breakup of this 747.
After the disappointment of the voice recorder, studying the wreckage becomes the only option for investigators. They focus their efforts on items that can either prove or disprove the link to TWA Flight 800.
So we play a lot of focus on the wreckage observation and examination of the central fuel tank.
On July the 12th, 48 days after the crash.
Okay, whoa, whoa. A little to the left, please.
Success.
All right. That's definitely the central fuel tank. Okay, let's mark that. Let's bring that up.
The tank joins the sea of wreckage piling up at the pier. Investigators study it closely for any evidence that it exploded. If it did explode like the TWA tank, it would be curled and twisted. And the metal would be bent outwards. But this fuel tank is different.
And we found the central fuel tank was relatively intact.
And it's crumpled inwards. Unlike the tank from the TWA flight, there's no soot. There would be if the jet fuel inside had ignited.
So at that time, we pretty much ruled out it was the cause of the central fuel tank.
The wreckage recovered so far has also forced investigators to abandon another theory, that a bomb brought down the plane.
None of the wreckage showed any evidence of sooting, any kind of explosive damage.
The China Airlines crash was neither a repeat of TWA Flight 800, nor a deliberate bombing. Investigators are running out of leads. As more wreckage is identified and recovered, investigators find an intriguing clue. It's discovered when they examine a series of small vents from Flight 611. All commercial jetliners have dozens of these vents near the floor. They're essentially pressure release valves. They're called dado panels, and there's only one reason for them to open. If the cargo area underneath the passengers were to suddenly decompress, the pressurized air above would exert so much force on the floor that it could collapse and damage vital flight controls. That's precisely what happened to a Turkish Airlines flight in 1974. The pilots couldn't control their plane after their cargo door blew out.
We've lost it!
If the floor on that flight hadn't collapsed, the pilots may have been able to save the plane. After that accident, the NTSB recommended that manufacturers install many more relief vents between a passenger plane's upper and lower levels. If there is decompression in the cargo area, the dado panels open automatically and release the pressure on the floor. There were 65 dado panels on the China Airlines flight. 19 of them were recovered from the ocean. 4 recovered panels were in the open position. It tells investigators that there must have been a sudden loss of pressure beneath the passenger cabin. But it doesn't tell them what caused it. The dado panels lead investigators closer to solving the mystery of this crash. But it's just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. There are hundreds of pieces of wreckage to be examined for clues. Kay Young now wonders if a few of those pieces might be able to tell him where the decompression originated.
I've been reading about the trajectory analysis you did on Flight 800. I'd like to try it.
Ballistic trajectory analysis is a technique that US investigators used to figure out how TWA Flight 800 disintegrated. It's impossible to do without specialized computers.
We figure that because it disintegrated in the midair, the ballistic analysis from which the NTSB did in TW800 could be very, very useful to us to help us to analyze the trajectory of the flying debris.
The analysis is based on a simple fact. The pieces that came off the plane first would be the first to hit the water. If investigators can figure out which pieces those were, they'll know where the trouble began. Radar that had been tracking the plane as it climbed also ended up tracking pieces of debris as they fell. The salvage workers have recorded the precise location of those same pieces of wreckage. Their logs could match a specific piece to its radar track. Investigators know the wind speed on the day of the crash, and they can obtain precise information about ocean currents. The last piece of the puzzle comes from the plane's flight data recorder. The plane's altitude, speed, and direction at the time of the breakup. As they're brought to the dock, every single piece of wreckage has been logged and numbered for identification.
327.
Kay Young selects 18 pieces of wreckage for the computer analysis. Some from the front, some from the middle, and some from the back of the plane.
199.
Along with all the other data, he'll feed information about each item's weight and shape into the computer.
526.
Based on where the pieces fell, the computer should be able to calculate which of those 18 pieces was the first to come off the plane.
Can we see when each one of those items separated from the aircraft?
All of the data paints a telling picture of what happened at 35,000 feet. Kay Young gets to see how Flight 611 broke up, from beginning to end.
The tail came off first.
Along with the dado panels, it's a very important clue.
Well, that pretty much indicating that there's something happened in the back of the aircraft, rather than something happened in the forward part.
Investigators are now keen to recover items from the rear of the plane. Hundreds of pieces of wreckage are piling up at the pier on the Penghu Islands. The NTSB sends metallurgist Frank Zakar to Taiwan to examine the wreckage.
I was walking along the yard where the wreckage was placed, and at that time I walked up to item 640 and noticed that there were some peculiar areas of interest that I wanted to look at a little bit further.
With this battered piece of metal, investigators have struck gold.
There was definitely a eureka moment on the dock. And that was, hey, we might have something here.
Hey, it's Frank. I think we found your golden nugget.
Item number 640 would give investigators a revealing glimpse into the past and lead them to conclude that the crash of Flight 611 actually began 22 years earlier.
Let's get as many pictures as we can.
The massive piece of fuselage that has caught Frank Zakar's attention is exactly what investigators have been searching for. It includes a piece of the belly, the sidewall, and the rear cargo door. It's from the back of the plane, precisely where the analysis told them the breakup had begun.
This piece of wreckage was highly unusual. It wasn't what we were seeing on all the other pieces, and it immediately drew our attention and drew the focus of the investigation.
The way most of the metal is torn suggests it ripped apart violently in midair.
aerodynamically, as an airplane's moving through the air, if it were to break apart, just the force of the incoming air at over 500 miles per hour will just break up perfectly good structure. That's what we call an overload fracture. So most of the pieces that came up early were just indicative of that kind of overload.
When metal breaks due to overload or overstress, it comes apart at an angle. But the fractured edges of piece number 640 aren't angled, they're flat.
What do you think?
It's definitely not overstress. It's metal fatigue.
Fatigue fractures happen when metal is stressed repeatedly over time until it breaks. It looks very different from a stress fracture.
Typically, a metal fatigue crack will have a flat appearance. It'll be very smooth.
That's exactly the kind of crack that investigators observe on piece number 640. That tells them it didn't break off the plane suddenly as it fell from the sky. This piece separated from the plane over time. Had it caused the deaths of 225 people?
There was much more work that needed to be done. A detailed analysis of the piece had to be done in order to see if this in fact was the smoking gun.
There's something else about this piece that stands out. It has a metal patch on it. It's called a doubler plate. It's the equivalent of a patch on a punctured tire. It's not unusual to find numerous doubler plates on older planes like this one.
A doubler plate is like a patch that you put over fuselage skin. If there were to be a tear or a blemish, a crack identified, you'd want to repair the fuselage back to its original strength, and one way to do that is to put a doubler plate or a patch right over the existing structure.
At some point, this section of the 747 had been repaired. Investigators need to know why it was fixed and how that was done.
We're looking for repair to the aft lower lobe. Whatever it was big.
Investigators sift through 22 years of documents. But the records are sketchy. Finding details on one particular repair could take time. There's something about this particular doubler that catches Frank Zakar's attention.
The outside of the fuselage contained longitudinal streaks that appeared to emanate from between the doubler plate and the skin.
Something is leaking from underneath the metal patch.
Was there a possibility that the skin had broken, cracked, and was there any fuel or air coming out from between the doubler and the fuselage? And that warranted further examination.
Let's cut it from here to here and send this piece to Chongshan.
In order to see what's underneath the doubler, a large section of piece 640 is sent to a lab. No evidence has been found of structural or mechanical problems with Boeing's 747-200 airplanes. Taiwanese aviation officials have no reason to keep the planes on the ground. The Chongshan Institute of Science and Technology is a military research facility. It's at the forefront of Taiwan's space program. This is where investigators take a section of piece number 640 for a closer examination. The NTSB's Frank Zakar finds a telling clue on the crack itself.
When I looked at the fracture surface, I found that this one specific area was covered with aluminum oxide, pretty much similar to rust on a car.
Years of exposure to oxygen changes the color of metal. The discoloration tells investigators that this particular crack at the rear of the airplane has been there for a very long time. Then, when the doubler is finally removed, Investigators get a look at the aluminium skin underneath. They're intrigued by what they see.
When we disassembled the doubler plate from the skin, we noticed that there were some fairly long gouge marks.
This is beyond the kind of damage a doubler is meant to patch.
That was an aha moment that we might have something here.
The search of the plane's documents also pays off. The records contain a very short reference to a mishap 22 years earlier, when this plane was only 6 months old.
Speed is low, sir. Watch it.
Its tail scraped the runway while landing.
Did you feel that?
It happens when a plane lands or takes off at too steep an angle. It's called a tail strike.
Dynasty 009, Hong Kong Tower. We observed smoke and sparks from your tail on landing.
Roger, Hong Kong Tower. We'll have that looked at. Tail strike, sir. I better log that.
It is a relatively common occurrence. It's not a good thing. Some airplanes even have what's called a bumper in that portion of the aft fuselage, so that if the tail ever does get too close to the ground, instead of sacrificing skin from the fuselage, you might have this sacrificial bumper that will take that wear.
Tail strike damage is routinely repaired. Investigators want to know how China Airlines went about fixing the plane. They can only find a brief mention of the repairs that were done in the plane's logbook.
That's all there is?
That's all we could find.
There's not a lot of detail in China Airlines records.
China Airlines indicating they could not find any of those documents. And when we start looking for it, we could not find any. And they said they probably got lost.
The documents that do exist show that the day after the tail strike, China Airlines did a temporary repair. Workers attached a large aluminium plate over the damaged area.
What do we know about the permanent repair?
It doesn't get much better.
A more permanent repair was to be carried out within 4 months.
This is what we got.
The maintenance records indicated that the permanent repair was done in accordance with Boeing recommendations in their structural repair manual. Evidence that we uncovered indicate that the repair was not done per the Boeing repair manual.
According to the manual, many of the scratches on the plane were too deep to be repaired. The entire damaged section should have been cut out and replaced.
You have to follow certain procedures, and the Boeing structural repair manual indicating very clearly what you should do step by step.
22 years later, investigators can tell that for some reason the damaged piece was not replaced. The scratches from the tail strike are still there. China Airlines engineers tell investigators that the scratched area was too large to cut out, so they sanded the scratches down instead.
In the event of scratching, it depends on how deep the scratches are. If they're not very deep, they can be blended out. But if the scratches are too deep, the repair technique that's called for is to actually cut out all of the scratched material and then design a doubler patch that's larger by a big percentage of the structure that was originally removed.
The scratches weren't sanded down or cut out. They're still there. Maintenance workers then made one final mistake.
They put the doubler plate right over the scratched material. The doubler plate that they put on was not 30% larger than the affected area. In fact, it was barely, maybe not even in certain locations, larger than the area that was scratched.
Even though the repair wasn't done according to Boeing's instructions, the way it was logged made it seem like it was. So for 22 years, anyone reading that entry would assume the damaged area had been cut out as it should have been.
Pieces were really starting to fall into place now. Once we saw this piece of structure that had the fatigue cracks in it, And we realized that it came from a structural repair that was not done properly, that was left to fly for 20 years.
Airborne passing 1,600.
Things began to make sense.
By covering an improper repair with a doubler and then documenting the repair as meeting Boeing standards, the workers made their mistake impossible to detect.
What was so insidious about this improper repair was that the doubler plate hid all of the damage. So if you weren't there watching them do this repair improperly, you wouldn't know that it was done improperly. You would have assumed that the structure underneath had been cut out the way it was supposed to.
And every time the plane took off over the next 20 years, the concealed problem got worse and worse. The air inside a commercial airplane is pressurized. As the plane climbs, air is forced into the cabin to keep the pressure inside the plane greater than the pressure outside. It's like inflating a tire. The inside air pushes against the plane's skin.
Each time the airplane pressurizes, pressure built up inside the fuselage of the airplane, that crack could open up for a certain amount of inches or microns or millimeters.
The plane's skin expanded and contracted a little bit every time. Because they weren't properly repaired, the cracks grew and spread. Eventually, the crack grew into a stunning 2.3 meters.
If you were charting the crack, you would have seen very slow growth early, but as time went on, the growth was getting bigger and bigger.
A small scratch had grown into an enormous problem. Then in May 2002, as Flight 611 climbed, that problem killed 225 people.
As the airplane climbed in altitude and the fuselage was pressured, that put enough strain on this growing crack that it reached its critical length. And from there, it just spread like a spider web. It went in all directions, and it probably looped all the way around the fuselage to the point where the entire aft section of the airplane just broke off from the rest of the structure.
The plane went into a steep dive. The force of the air on what was left of the plane quickly ripped it to pieces. Investigators know that an unseen crack caused Flight 611 to break apart. They now discover that China Airlines came heartbreakingly close to finding that crack and saving 225 lives. The China Airlines 747 was in regular service for 22 years following the improper repair to its skin. It took off and landed more than 20,000 times. Over the years, mechanics would have scrutinized the plane.
There's regular inspections per the Boeing maintenance program that have to be performed on the airplane.
But the massive crack forming at the rear of the plane was never detected. Another accident in another country almost led China Airlines to discover the hidden damage. In 1988, the roof peeled off an aging Boeing 737 owned by Aloha Airlines. As a result of that incident, the Federal Aviation Administration laid out an inspection procedure for older planes. Airlines around the world were forced to inspect their planes much more diligently for corrosion and cracks. The regulation called for airlines to reevaluate all existing repairs to a plane's structure.
Indications on this airplane were that if they had looked at the maintenance records and compared it to the repair, they would have had to remove the repair and redo it.
China Airlines took the first steps of the new procedure in 2001, a year before the accident. The airline identified and photographed 31 different doublers on the 747, including the one over the catastrophic crack. Those pictures show investigators that China Airlines overlooked a vital clue that could have warned them of the looming danger.
We examined the photographs that China Airlines took of the repair, and noticed that there was some issues that may have warranted further investigation.
Investigators see a dark brown stain on the outside of the plane. It's the same mysterious staining that led Frank Zakar to suspect there was a hole behind the doubler when he first saw it on the pier. So why hadn't this stain raised alarms before the crash? For years, passengers on China Airlines' doomed 747 were allowed to smoke. They filled the pressurized air with nicotine. The smoke was being forced out through the crack at the rear of the plane. Over time, that smoke left a nicotine stain on the outside of the plane.
It was very vivid. Any experienced maintenance engineer be able to spot it right immediately.
Smoking hadn't been allowed on China Airlines for 7 years before the crash. It tells investigators that the crack in the plane had been there for at least that long. But instead of investigating the source of the staining,
we need to conduct the new inspection when we do our next major check.
China Airlines scheduled the second part of the FAA's procedure, a detailed inspection of the repaired areas.
And that would be the 7C check, currently scheduled for November the 2nd, 2002.
But the 747 never made it to November 2nd, 2002. It came apart over the Taiwan Strait 5 months before the inspection that would have undoubtedly uncovered its hidden flaw. Investigators want to prevent a similar accident from ever happening again. They recommend that aviation agencies around the world immediately inspect repairs for any possible hidden damage.
We were no longer going to accept just a quick write-up that the repair was done properly. If the repair didn't have all the necessary documentation to allow us to know it was done properly, we were requiring operators to take doubler plates off and do a visual inspection of the structure underneath.
The National Transportation Safety Board issues its own recommendations. The board asks that maintenance personnel be warned of the consequences of hiding the kind of damage that could lead to the structural failure of an airplane.
The moral of this story is that the repair has to be done properly. As a mechanic, when you're doing work on an airplane, you're not thinking about the people who might be flying on that fuselage 20 years from now, but their safety depends on you doing the repair properly.
China Airlines has revised the way its fleet is inspected and maintained. Its safety record has improved dramatically since the crash of Flight 611. Investigators also proposed the development of new tools that would allow mechanics to detect damage behind a doubler. Such tools are being used today.
Boeing developed a non-destructive procedure that can find cracks in the fuselage underneath the doubler.
That device uses ultrasound, sound waves that travel through metal. It can reveal damage underneath a doubler. It's the same technology that allows doctors to observe a fetus while it's still inside the womb. The device would have been able to detect the crack behind Flight 611's doubler plate. But the technology has some limitations.
A great number of hours are required just to do one specific area of the airplane, but the technology is getting better.
The problems that led to the China Airlines disaster are not going away. Planes the world over are getting older. And older planes need to be more thoroughly inspected for cracks. 6 years after the China Airlines crash, Southwest Airlines in the United States was hit with a record-breaking fine. $10.2 million for missing inspections designed to find cracks.
The finding of Southwest brings back into focus how important it is to do maintenance properly on an airplane.
A proper program of maintenance and inspections can be costly. But as China Airlines showed, the price of not maintaining aging planes is even costlier.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north.
A Boeing 737 is badly off course.
Adam 574, confirm our position, please.
The crew struggles to get the plane back on track.
This is crazy!
They're lost in a violent storm when their plane starts rolling over.
Pull up! Pull up!
The lives of 102 people are at risk.
Adam 574, Yuzhong control.
Then mysteriously, Adam Air Flight 574 disappears without a trace. January the 1st, 2007, Surabaya, Indonesia. It's New Year's Day. There are celebrations throughout the country. Surabaya's airport is bustling. And not just because of the holidays. Indonesia is experiencing a boom of budget airlines. Many people are taking advantage of the cheaper fares.
For the average Indonesian, it meant that the explosion of low-cost carriers made it much more possible to actually get on a plane and fly.
One of those new airlines is Adam Air.
Good afternoon, departure. This is Adam 574.
Adam 574, this is ground control. Go ahead.
Adam Air was successful because it provided a fresh image to the industry. I mean, they came in with, bright colors. The airplanes were painted in fantastic orange. The crew was, flashy uniform. They had everything right going for them.
Captain Refri Widodo has been flying with Adam Air for 6 months. Today, he's in command of Flight 574, a short domestic flight. His co-pilot, Yoga Susanto, has been with the airline for almost 1.5 years. Before the discount travel boom, many passengers wouldn't have been able to afford this flight.
More and more people were able to fly, could afford the tickets, and they didn't care too much about the services offered simply because they just were intent on getting from point A to point B as cheaply as possible.
There are 96 passengers and 6 crew members on today's flight. Controllers at the airport are busy juggling planes.
Okay, the 574 is clear for takeoff.
80 knots. Check. V1. Rotate.
Today's flight is a routine 2-hour hop. From Surabaya on the island of Java to Manado on the island of Sulawesi, almost 1,700 kilometers northeast. It's the beginning of the rainy season. Weather is unpredictable. Forecasters are expecting fierce storms. Captain Widodo is aware that there may be bad weather ahead.
Turn right direct to Fando and climb to flight level 330.
Roger, turn right direct to Fando and climb to flight level 330, Adam 574.
Minutes after takeoff, the crew turns on the autopilot. The flight computer will fly the plane and navigate it along a pre-planned route to Manado.
Now passing flight level 220, climbing to flight level 330.
Roger, Adam 574, track direct to Diola.
Confirmed. Tracking direct to Diola, Adam 574.
22,000 feet below, air traffic controllers track the flight's progress on radar and confirm that it's on course. The plane is beginning to experience some turbulence. Less than half an hour into the flight, air traffic controllers notice something out of the ordinary.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north.
Flight 574 has flown off course and is now heading into a violent storm. Air traffic controllers don't know why.
Yes.
On board the plane, the pilots try to understand how far they have drifted off course.
The IRS. 28 is the difference.
And try to fix the problem with the computerized system that handles navigation.
May I have your attention? This is your captain speaking. We are about to experience some turbulence.
Could all the passengers return to their seats?
Controllers on the ground try to get Flight 574 back on course, giving them directions to their next assigned waypoint called Diola.
Adam Air 574, maintain 350, direct to Diola.
Confirmed, flight level 350, direct to Diola, Adam 574.
But to get there, Flight 574 must pass through a severe storm. "137-kilometer-an-hour winds beat on the plane's hull. It's pounded by hail and rain. The weather is making it hard to see. The crew is not just concerned with the weather. They're still also trying to understand the problem with the plane's navigation system.
This is messed up.
Getting lost over the ocean is everyone's worry, because when you lose your navigational instruments or you lose trust of your navigation instruments, what do?
Co-pilot Susanto consults the aircraft's handbook.
It's starting to fly like a bamboo ship.
Captain Widodo doesn't know where he is. He needs directions.
Confirm our position.
Adam 574, confirm our position, please.
Roger, Adam 574. Position is 125 miles. Mike, Kilo Sierra, crossing radial 307. Mike, Kilo Sierra.
The weather in Mike Kilo Sierra isn't good.
The storm is growing worse.
This is crazy.
We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
Captain Widodo wants to take over navigation of the plane from the flight computer.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
But suddenly, a warning. The autopilot has disengaged completely. Then many of Susanto's computerized instruments go blank. The crew doesn't notice that their plane is rolling over. Flight 574 is banking at a dangerous angle.
They entered this.
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
If it rolls too far over, it could send the plane and the 102 people on board into a fatal downward spiral.
Okay, put it back on nav again. Put it back on nav again. Put it on nav again.
Captain Widodo wants to re-engage the flight computer's navigation system. The plane is still rolling, and now its nose has started to point downward. Another alarm tells the pilots that they are entering a steep descent.
Don't turn it! This is our heading!
Adam 574, Yujun Control. Adam 574, Yujun Control. Adam 574, radar service terminated. Please contact Yujun Control at 128.1.
Inexplicably, Flight 574 has disappeared. News of Adam Air Flight 574's disappearance spreads quickly. The Indonesian government starts mobilizing search and rescue teams to find it. First Air Marshal Eddie Suyanto will coordinate the search and rescue.
Pada tanggal 1 Januari 2007.
On the 1st of January 2007, I received a verbal notification from the Vice Assistant Operation Head of Air Force that Adam Air had not landed in Manado.
Belum mendarat di Manado.
Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, or NTSC, is also notified. The NTSC is responsible for finding out what went wrong in any plane crash. Franz Wieners is in charge of investigating Adam Air 574.
The first steps that we take when there was an accident or serious incident, we will find all the resources that we have and get the team together before we dispatch to the area.
Working with air traffic control, the searchers try to pinpoint the last recorded location of Flight 574.
Mendapatkan laporan juga bahwa
I received the report that Adam Air was lost from the radar in the Majin Sea.
Laut Majeni.
The plane was last detected by radar as it was crossing the sea, about halfway through its intended journey.
Okay, so right around here.
But the plane could have flown hundreds of kilometers after that signal was received. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact location.
When the aircraft went missing, it was a bit of a shock for everybody because in this day and age, nobody expects an aircraft to go missing.
Without a specific location, searchers try to figure out how large an area to scan. Since they know how much fuel was on board, investigators can calculate how far the plane could have flown since it was last detected.
If this is their last radar hit, they didn't have enough fuel to fly any further than this.
More than 3,000 people are sent out to look for the plane. The Indonesians are joined by a US Navy vessel. But the area they have to search is the size of Ireland. The teams don't even know whether to look on land or on water.
And as long as there was no definitive word, hope remained.
12 hours pass without any confirmed sightings. And then friends and relatives' hopes are raised with news that survivors have been found.
A new report came in saying that they had found the Adam Air wreckage in the mountainous area of Polowali, with 100 victims and 12 survivors still alive.
rescue teams hurry to the island of Sulawesi, hoping to return survivors to their families. They also hope to discover what went wrong on board the plane.
When news broke that some people might have survived the crash, the already incredibly stressed and emotional families of the survivors thought, whoa, maybe there is a chance. Maybe my wife, cousin, husband, brother has survived.
But when the first officials get there, they find that these survivors are not from the flight at all.
So they were ferry survivors, not airplane survivors.
They're from a ship that sank in another storm near where Flight 574 is thought to have crashed. Now the rescue teams are back to square one.
It led people's hopes up. And people flocked to Makassar and they were finding ways how to get to the crash site, only to find that it's not there.
For family members, it's a bitter disappointment.
Sebetulnya kita malu.
We were ashamed because the information was already spread all over before we verified it. Our government was embarrassed that we publicized that information.
It's been a week since the crash. With each passing day, the chance of finding any survivors grows smaller.
There was still no clear picture of exactly where the plane had crashed and how it had gone down and why it had gone down.
Wieners needs to locate the wreckage as soon as possible. Most of all, he needs the 2 black boxes that record conversations in the cockpit and flight data. There are beacons attached to the boxes, but they only have a 30-day battery life. 9 days after the crash of Adam Air Flight 574, a fisherman finds what he thinks might be part of an airplane, 300 meters off the coast of Sulawesi. The piece is taken to an Indonesian Air Force base for analysis. Franz Wieners quickly identifies that it is part of a Wright elevator. He examines it to see if it belongs to Adam Air Flight 574.
We checked with the serial numbers, we checked with the part numbers.
The numbers match.
So we are definitely sure that it is from the aircraft.
The finding confirms that Flight 574 crashed at sea. The team can now narrow down its search to the area where the elevator was found. Since the accident involves an American-made plane, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board joins the investigation. And they send structural engineer Clint Cruikshanks to Indonesia.
We started working with the NTSC to look at radar data, air traffic transmissions, weather data, trying to bring all that information together to find the airplane.
The water that investigators plan to search for wreckage is 6,500 feet deep, much too deep to send down divers.
It was quite deep water, deeper than we're normally used to recovering airplanes from.
The Indonesian government wants Adam Air to pay for the salvage operation. Investigators meet with representatives of the airline.
It is going to be expensive. We need to hire contractors to go down that far.
Adam Air felt that its responsibility only went so far. The government and most of public opinion believed that Adam Air's responsibility was actually almost total, because they were the owners of the airline.
The airline refuses to pay for the salvage, triggering a lengthy negotiation. This is not good news for Franz Wieners. Unless someone puts up the money to search the seabed for wreckage, the mystery of Flight 574 will not be solved. It is also a blow to the families of the victims.
The families obviously wanted to know what had happened to their loved ones, and they did want the government and Adam Air to combine to get the flight data recorders out of the water.
As the investigation stalls, public anger grows.
People were becoming more and more critical of Adam Air and the way it was being run.
But then, after 7 months of negotiating,
this is good news. Thank you.
Adam Air agrees to help pay for the salvage. Phoenix International, an American company specializing in deepwater salvage, starts the operation on August the 24th. But the time they've lost has had a serious consequence. Although they have a fix on the location of the crash, the locator beacons attached to the black boxes have gone dead.
If the black boxes are not found, it will be a mystery until today.
Without the beacon, finding 2 small boxes among the wreckage will be a huge challenge. To make matters worse, Adam Air has only put up enough money for 1 week of searching.
So it was like, go out there, if you don't find anything in 7 days, you're done.
After locating debris with sonar, an unmanned remote-controlled submarine is sent down to look for the black boxes.
All right, how are we doing?
We dove on one location first. We got to that GPS location. There was nothing there.
Pull up quadrant 3.
So we sat down and decided we'd do a grid search about that point, and so we did a very methodical search.
Okay, 3 degrees. All right. Slow, slow. We're coming up on something.
We started picking up small, lightweight pieces of airplane wreckage. Things like life vests, seat trays, light bits of metal.
Oh my God, this is it.
Investigators get their first look at the wreckage.
This plane is ripped apart.
The state of the wreckage illustrates just how violent this plane crash was.
The little pieces of wreckage didn't tell us anything about the cause of the crash. They did tell us, however, that the airplane hit the water at a very high rate of speed. This was the most fragmented airplane that I have ever seen.
Only 2 days into the operation, Cruikshank spots something.
All right, stop. Rotate back 5 degrees.
I noticed on the left side of the video screen something that appeared to be orange, and I instructed the ROV operator to take a closer look at it.
That's it. That's it. Okay.
Once we got over there, we realized that, yeah, this in fact was the FDR.
The plane's flight data recorder has been found.
All right, good work, Joe. Let's get this up.
We were very excited that we had seen and recovered one of the boxes.
Investigators soon find the cockpit voice recorder nearby.
All right, stop. That's it.
Their week is up. The salvage operation is over. Investigators now hope that they have all the clues they need to solve this accident.
The black boxes is the only source for the evidence that we have, because we don't have the wreckage, we don't have the witnesses.
But the boxes have been lying on the bottom of the sea for almost 8 months. They could be damaged beyond repair. They may not yield any information at all. The black boxes from Adam Air Flight 574 are taken to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. Investigators think the labs there are the best bet at salvaging any possible information.
If an FDR is found in salt water, it needs to be washed in fresh water and then contained in water the entire time until it makes it to our lab.
Salt and air together create a chemical reaction that results in rust. The rust can damage the electronic components in the recorders. Keeping them submerged in fresh water delays that reaction.
The importance of having the data depends on the circumstances of the accident. If you're able to recover wreckage in other parts to investigate, then you don't necessarily need to rely on the data. For this particular accident, since the wreckage was going to stay at the bottom of the ocean, it was essential that we had data from the recorders.
Franz Wieners also makes the trip to the United States.
The FDR and the CVR, when they were recovered from the bottom of the sea, the cases were actually 50 to 60% damage.
We thought there might be an issue in recovering the data. It wasn't as damaged as many others we've seen, so we were fairly confident if there was data recorded, we would be able to get the data off of it.
Technicians begin the painstaking process of retrieving the information. The job is a multinational effort.
The Australian Transport Safety Bureau was requested to assist. We have an excellent relationship with the NTSB folk, and so our flight recorder specialist went to the United States and worked alongside the NTSB.
The electronic components containing the data are carefully removed and dried. Then the information is uploaded onto a computer. As the delicate procedure of recovering the data from both recorders progresses, investigators are aware that they have an additional concern.
As you can tell,
one problem that we ran up against in this investigation is the maintenance records indicated that the flight data recorder was written up as being inoperable in the weeks prior to the crash. We were concerned with that in that if we found the FDR, it may not have recorded anything.
Investigators keep their fingers crossed.
we've got it all. It's all there.
I was confident once we found out that we had 100% of the data that we would be able to solve this accident.
The two black boxes provide investigators with the first solid clues about why Flight 574 fell from the sky.
Good afternoon, departure. This is Adam 574. Now passing
Flight level 220, climbing to flight level 330.
Roger, Adam 574, track direct to Diola.
Confirmed, tracking direct to
Diola, Adam 574.
The conversation in the cockpit tells investigators that the crew knew that the plane's navigation system was sending them off course.
The IRS.
28 is the difference.
They're drifting.
And that they were preoccupied with fixing that problem.
This is messed up.
Where's Adam direct to? My God, he's flying north. Adam Air 574, maintain 350, direct to Diola.
Confirmed, flight level 350, direct to Diola, Adam 574.
To get from one waypoint to the next, the flight computer always has to know the plane's exact location. That information comes from a component called the IRS, or Inertial Reference System. It tracks every adjustment to the plane's course to calculate its exact position. It then feeds that information to the autopilot.
The autopilot needs to know where the aircraft is and where it needs to go. Now, the autopilot takes those data from the IRS in terms of height, heading, and speed.
But for the system to keep track of the plane's heading, It has to know where the plane started. The IRS has to be calibrated before takeoff. Usually, the crew will enter the coordinates of the gate as the starting point for the computer to track. Investigators wonder if the IRS guided the plane off course because the wrong initial coordinates were entered.
Franz, we just got this.
They check this by looking at information from the flight data recorder.
The numbers are fine when they're on the ground.
Yes.
The data confirms the IRS was calibrated before Adam Air Flight 574 took off.
This is where it begins.
But for some reason, the IRS began to send the plane off course almost as soon as the flight got in the air.
Just gets worse and worse.
I have something else I'd like to show you. Some maintenance logs.
Cruikshanks and Wieners look at the maintenance history of the IRS system that was on board Flight 574.
As you can tell, there's more than 100 write-ups here. Look at this.
Same unit. Same problem.
That's right.
The history shows that there had been numerous complaints about the plane's navigation system over the past 3 months.
Again and again.
Investigators wonder why the airline didn't fix the problem.
In the case of the IRS of this aircraft, that unit should have been taken out and sent to maintenance for calibration or repairs.
Investigators discover that when pilots complained about a faulty IRS unit, the airline didn't fix it properly. They would either swap it with a unit from another plane, or often they would only do a basic cleaning of the malfunctioning unit.
They just pull up the connectors, spray it with some lubricant cleaners, then put it back on, did some ground test, and then just put ground test OK on the maintenance log.
Since the IRS is such a vital piece of equipment, this is contrary to all recommended repair policies. Investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, hoping to discover how the malfunctioning IRS contributed to the crash.
This is crazy! We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
Don't turn it! This is our heading! Pull up! Pull up!
But nothing they hear leads them to believe that an IRS malfunction alone could have caused the plane to crash.
If you have a failure in one system of the airplane, it shouldn't cause an accident.
Investigators now wonder if the severe storm Flight 574 flew into somehow played a role in this crash.
This is messed up. This is really messed up. It's starting to fly like a bamboo ship. Confirm our position.
Weather is a well-known cause of airline accidents. It can wreak havoc with the airplane and disorient pilots. In 1977, a Southern Airways DC-9 flew into a violent storm near New Hope, Georgia.
Our left engine just cut out.
Hail clogged the engines. They tore themselves apart.
Got the other engine going too.
Brace for impact!
The plane slammed into the small town, and 72 people were killed. In order to determine if weather was a factor in the Adam Air crash, investigators need a more complete picture of what happened on board the flight. They want to know everything the crew did and said from the time they discovered that they were off course to the time they hit the water. To do this, they combine the data from the two black boxes to create a computer simulation of the flight.
That gave us very close to the possibility of what really happened with the aircraft.
Investigators return to Jakarta to study the simulation.
within Mike Kilo Sierras isn't good.
This is crazy!
We're going to get lost if it stays like this.
They can see that throughout most of the flight, the computer was navigating the plane. But since the flight computer was sending the plane off course, the captain decided to navigate the plane himself.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
Co-pilot Susanto switched the navigation system to a mode that would keep the plane flying straight and level. Captain Widodo could now change his course.
This is where they switch from nav to attitude.
Switching from one mode to the other forces some computerized gauges to temporarily go blank while they reset. One is the ADI, or Artificial Horizon, which tells the crew if the plane is flying level.
ADI goes off and stays off.
There was also another much more serious consequence to the switch.
That's where the plane starts its right roll.
The autopilot disengaged when they consciously selected from the nav mode to the attitude mode, and then the aircraft commenced an almost imperceptible roll to the right of around about 1 degree per second.
The captain missed a crucial step when he switched his flight computer from one mode to the other.
Quick reference handbook, please.
He should have flown his plane straight and level while the computer adjusted to the new setting.
Maintain straight and level, constant airspeed flight until attitude displays recover. Approximately 30 seconds. It's in the manual.
Any pilot who is trained and qualified on the Boeing 737-400 is regarded to have a sufficient knowledge that whenever they switch the nav mode to attitude, they have to maintain wings level for 30 seconds.
But neither of the pilots did that. It's an oversight with grave consequences. Without that step, the autopilot disengages completely. The flight computer did send out a warning when that happened, but the warning was ignored. The crew didn't seem to notice that the autopilot was no longer flying the plane. And it only took seconds for that to become a very serious problem. The data tells investigators that this plane had a natural tendency to roll to the right. Old planes, like old cars, don't always go straight. Throughout the flight, the autopilot compensated for that by raising the aileron on the plane's left wing. An aileron is a movable flap on the wing that controls how much the plane rolls to the left and right. But once the autopilot disengaged, it stopped compensating and the ailerons went back to a neutral position. That allowed the plane to revert to its tendency to roll to the right.
And they don't even notice.
At this point, the plane was rolling at a rate of 1 degree per second. Focused on their faulty navigation system, and with thick clouds obscuring the horizon, the pilots had no idea that their plane was dipping. It's not uncommon for pilots to get disoriented in this way.
Your body will start to fool you. Your senses will start sending you false information or false senses. You might think that you are actually going straight and level, while you're actually rolling slowly to the right or to the left.
The 737 is programmed to issue a warning when it rolls past 35 degrees.
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
The flight data recorder shows investigators that in response to that alert, Captain Widodo did attempt to level the plane.
They get an oral warning from the airplane that says, hey, bank angle, bank angle. And at that point, they made some small inputs to the controls, but they didn't fly the airplane.
Believing that the autopilot would keep the plane level, Widodo soon turned his attention back to the problematic IRS.
When the pilot engrossed the troubleshooting of the IRS, their ability to pay attention for the other tasks is reduced. Further, these IRS anomalies has become
the only priority at the moment.
Usually you would say one pilot deals with the system issue, the other pilot flies the airplane. They were both dealing with this system issue and totally focused on the issue, so they never saw what was happening.
This is not the first accident involving what we would call spatial disorientation.
It was almost 3 years earlier to the day that another flight, Flash Airlines 604, taking off over the Red Sea, had a similar fate.
See what the aircraft just did?
Distracted by a malfunctioning component in the cockpit, the captain may have become disoriented.
Autopilot! Autopilot!
Like the Adam Air flight, the captain's attention was focused on his flight computer. And like the Adam Air flight, his plane began rolling dangerously to the right. Investigators concluded that without any external references, the captain simply couldn't tell that his plane was falling from the sky.
Tragically, just because there is an inertial reference system failure, or let's say in another accident there might be an engine failure, does not mean that an aircraft has to crash.
It's 60 degrees now and there's no attempt at recovery.
Don't turn it! This is our heading! Pull out! Pull out!
Investigators can see that when Captain Widodo does take action, he makes the situation much worse. With his plane still banked drastically to the right, Captain Widodo should have leveled his wings and then pulled his nose up. He did the opposite. He began pulling back on his control column before his wings were level. That forced the plane into a tight spiral dive.
Basically, it rolled, and it just kept rolling until it almost went inverted and just fell, it kind of fell out of the sky once it got to a point where it wasn't flying like a normal airplane should.
The aircraft was descending at nearly 900 kilometres an hour, at a vertical speed at times reaching in excess of 21,000 feet per minute.
That's almost the speed of sound, and more than 150 kilometers an hour faster than this plane was designed to withstand.
It's rolling over rapid descent. They can't recover now.
At that speed, the plane is no longer able to hold itself together.
And that sound, that's the sound of the plane coming apart.
The black boxes have revealed how Flight 574 crashed. But they also raise crucial questions.
It's just one error after another.
There was ample opportunity, ample time for the pilots to correct the situation.
The investigators have come to a disturbing conclusion. The only mechanical failure was with the plane's navigation system. And that shouldn't have caused the crash. The more significant failures were human.
Okay, put the IRS in attitude.
But why should qualified pilots make these disastrous mistakes?
Don't turn it! This is our heading!
To find these answers, investigators must look at the airline itself. This one accident will raise serious questions about Indonesia's entire aviation industry. Investigators turn their attention from the actions of the pilots on Flight 574 to the airline that employed them, Adam Air. They meet with the owners.
France wings.
Adam Air was founded in 2002 by a wealthy businesswoman named Sandra Ang. Ang named the airline after her son, Adam, whom she also appointed as the company's president.
We need to know more about your training program.
The investigators interview Adam Air pilots.
Did the airline provide any training on recovery procedures in the event of an IRS failure? No.
They want to find out more about how the airline trained its flight crews.
What about recovery techniques? IRS troubleshooting? No?
What they uncover is disturbing.
We could not find any evidence that the pilot was properly trained when they have a sudden disengaging autopilot or when they're flying with the IRS failure.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
As they dig deeper, investigators find an airline plagued with safety issues. 11 months before the Adam Air crash, in February 2006, another Adam Air plane, Flight 782, flew off course the same way as Flight 574. That crew was also getting faulty navigation data. But they couldn't even reach controllers on the radio. They couldn't get directions. They were badly lost for 3 hours.
The crew was trying to find where they were. The ATC was trying to find where they were. And they were over the water.
Like Flight 574, they had a malfunctioning IRS. In the end, the plane landed almost 500 kilometers south of where it should have been.
They just continued until they found an island. And it had an airport in it, and they said, okay, we have to land there, otherwise we don't know where we're going to go. And they landed, and they didn't know exactly where they were until they landed.
6 months after Flight 574, the European Commission banned all Indonesian airlines from flying to Europe.
That sent a very strong message to the whole world that we, the European Union, believe that all Indonesian airlines are unsafe and you should not fly on them.
Then in March 2008, there's another accident involving Adam Air, this time in the city of Batam.
And the airplane slewed off the runway, came to rest on the side. The evacuation was a bit strange. Nose lights were deployed, and that was a final accident. And after that, I think everybody said, enough's enough, you know.
People who did care, people who were wanting to shake up the industry and reform it and improve it, were horrified that the situation had been so bad within Adam Air and that the authorities had allowed such a situation to continue and deteriorate.
Immediately after the crash in Batam, the Indonesian government suspended and then ultimately revoked Adam Air's license to operate. It is also apparent that Adam Air isn't the only Indonesian airline with problems.
Prior to the Adam Air crash, Indonesia experienced a bad crash about every year to 18 months.
Many of those accidents involved the discount carriers that the government had allowed to thrive. More than 50 such airlines were in operation at the time of the Adam Air crash.
The problem, though, was that this expansion occurred in a way that was not properly monitored, not properly regulated by the government. Thousands and thousands of people are being employed to work for airlines when they just don't have the experience to do so and are not being adequately trained, as the investigation report into the Adam Air crash demonstrated.
Indonesia's poor safety record forces the government to take steps to improve airline safety throughout the country. It begins rating airlines on safety and grounds those that don't comply. There have been fewer fatal incidents since the reforms. But a year and a half after it was put in place, the European Union's ban on Indonesian airlines was still in effect. Those familiar with Indonesian aviation think the reforms could go even further.
So that we have no more Adam Airs, we have no more companies that cut costs too much and gives all these extra risks to the public, because that's not what the public should receive. The public should receive a reliable and safe means of air transportation.